Good evening, everyone. I would like to welcome you to the Krasno Global Event series. It is great to see you again in the Mandela Auditorium at UNC-Chapel and also live on Zoom outside in the virtual realm. And I'm happy to say that I'm very pleased to see so many people in the auditorium, and I'm very pleased to see even more people on Zoom. We have two distinguished guests today, Professor Benjamin Hett and Professor Gerhard Weinberg, and I will introduce both of them to you in a minute. I'm Klaus Larres, I'm the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs here at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I've been organizing the Krasno event series for the last 10 years, believe it or not, and we are still going strong, of course. Today we are talking about the death of democracy and Hitler's rise to power and the lessons we can learn from this for our own tumultuous times. Democracy is under attack in many countries in the world, including in the United States. We have had the development of so-called illiberal democracy in Hungary, for example, and this country has clearly become an autocracy. And we have seen the election of a far-right prime minister in Italy who has neo-fascist roots. In many other countries around the world, dictatorship and even totalitarianism is on the rise, and frequently claims are being made that that is the future, that autocracy is a model for how to govern our countries in the future. When going back in history, however, to the days of Hitler and Mussolini, for example, we realize, of course, what utter misery and destruction dictatorship and Nazism and fascism have brought to the world. A look at Russian dictator Putin's war of aggression on Ukraine tells us that the modern form of dictatorship and attempt at empire building are no better than the previous ones. Still, it remains puzzling how the German democratic Weimar Republic could be transformed into a fully blown dictatorship so quickly within just a few years. Our guest today will reanalyze this crucial episode in European and world history. After all, there are important lessons to be learned from this for our own tumultuous and violent times. It is a great pleasure to welcome our main speaker today, Professor Benjamin Hett. Ben Hett is a professor of history at Hunter College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Ben is a former lawyer who, after 4 years of legal practices, and he says it felt more like 8 years rather than 4 years, he decided to do an MA at the University of Toronto in Canada and a PhD at Harvard to become a history professor. Ben Hett first taught at Harvard, and since 2003 he has been at Hunter College in New York. In his work, Ben has focused on the history of National Socialism, the Second World War, and now also on the German intelligence services in the 1950s. Ben has obtained multiple impressive awards and prizes, too many to mention here, and he has published many very well-regarded books on German history in the 1930s and 1940s. One of his books, for example, deals with the burning of the Reichstag in 1933. And his book on the death of democracy and the rise of Hitler and the downfall of the Weimar Republic has become an international bestseller. It is indeed a great read, and I can warmly recommend it to you. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Ben Hett to the Krasno Global Event series today. Our other special guest is the William Rand Keenan Professor Emeritus at UNC, Gerhard Weinberg. Born in 1928, Gerhard has been at UNC since 1974. Gerhard Weinberg is one of the most eminent historians of Germany and National Socialism and the Second World War in the country, if not the world. He has written many books and articles on these issues and has received numerous prizes and awards. He also was involved in many invigorating and sometimes quite controversial scholarly debates. Perhaps Gerhard's most well-known book, which many of you will have read, is A World at Arms, A Global History of the Second World War, which has come out with Cambridge University Press. Today, Gerhard will comment on Ben Hett's talk. It is, of course, a great pleasure and an honor to have the eminent Gerhard Weinberg with us today. Thank you all for joining us today. We are videotaping the event today, as always, and I would like to point out our famous YouTube channel to you. That is YouTube youtube.com/KrasnoUNC. Everyone here in the Mandela Auditorium and everyone watching us on Zoom today is more than welcome to submit your questions to us in writing. If you are in the room, just raise your hands, of course, and one of our Krasno assistants will rush to you with a microphone and ask you to pose your question. If you are following us on Zoom, then please send us your written question with the help of the chat function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Our Krasno assistants will select your questions and read them out aloud to all of us. Let me welcome once again our distinguished speakers, Professor Benjamin Hett and Professor Gerhard Weinberg, to the Krasno Global Event series here at UNC-Chapel. Perhaps let us first listen to Professor Ben Hett's talk. Ben will enlighten us about the death of democracy and Hitler's rise to power and the lessons we can learn from this for our own times. Ben, here's the time.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Klaus, for that really kind introduction. I'm really happy and really honored to be here. This is my first time in North Carolina. I've been in North Carolina since about 9:30 this morning, my first time ever here. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm very glad to have you all here. I'd like to thank Professor Larres for this invitation to come here, and I'm really honored to be sharing the stage with a historian I've revered for a very long time, Professor Weinberg. And I will be waiting with some trepidation for what Professor Weinberg has to say after. So let me start with this. So today is November 9th. I'm sure many of you will know that this is a date of some considerable significance in German history. It was the day in November 1918 when Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated and was replaced by a new sort of proto-democratic administration. It was the day in 1923 when a rather, up until then, obscure private first class in the German army from World War I named Adolf Hitler attempted a coup d'etat from a beer hall in Munich in the company of the deputy commander-in-chief of the German army from World War I, General Erich Ludendorff. It was the day in 1938, Professor Weinberg and I were actually just talking about this a little bit, it was the day in 1938 of the infamous Kristallnacht, the first really major outbreak of violence against Jews in Germany at the hands of the Nazis. And on a rather brighter note, it was the day in 1989 that the Berlin Wall was opened. We always say it fell, but it didn't fall. More accurately, it was opened. So it's an interesting date, which seems to come up again and again in German history. I say that sort of by way of introduction. I'm going to segue back to one of those events I mentioned, November 9th, 1923, where Hitler and Ludendorff attempted to overthrow the German government from a Munich beer hall. And Erich Ludendorff, I want to start with this point. Erich Ludendorff is a man whose importance in German history is, I think, not always fully appreciated. Certainly his role as a commander in World War I is well known. In that role, he also was very much an architect of the policies by which Germany ran its First World War effort, particularly its mobilization of people and resources for the war effort, which basically means Ludendorff was a pioneering architect of the concept that we now know of as total war, a pioneering practitioner and architect of it. But then, in some ways more interestingly, after World War I, he became what I would call a pioneering theorist of total war. After the war, he was a prolific writer. He wrote a number of books. In the early 20s, he wrote one called Military Leadership and Politics, Kriegführung und Politik. And then his last book, published in 1935, was actually in German, entitled Total War, Der Totale Krieg, translated in English as The Nation in Arms. And in these books, in various ways, Ludendorff sort of set out a theory of how Germany could mobilize effectively for a rematch, in a sense, for another total war. And what he said was in some ways really quite interesting. He thought that Germany was up against a global challenge that really was almost too much for it in terms of the resources that Germany's potential enemies could command, the economic resources, the population resources, And so he knew that to win a major contest, Germany would have to mobilize with an effectiveness it hadn't managed in the First World War. And he thought that this would involve a number of elements, really systematically organizing work, conscripting labor, conscripting male young men for the army and so on, but also harnessing resources effectively. And there were a few other things he had taken as lessons from the war. He felt that Germany had really lost the propaganda war in World War I, and so that in future war, Germany would need to propagandize its own people effectively for mobilization, but also stop foreign propaganda from reaching Germans. He thought internal dissent had been a major problem in Germany's First World War. And so to fight effectively again, Germany would have to have a regime powerful enough and authoritarian enough to stifle dissent, to crack down on all dissent. And he talked in this connection of creating, with, in a sense, the carrot and stick of propaganda and crushing of dissent, a really unified national community, Volksgemeinschaft, as it is said in German. And that would be the essential prerequisite of an effective war effort in the future. Now, Ludendorff became acquainted with Hitler in 1921, and we don't know a lot about their connection, other than they did, in a sense, work together politically for a couple of years, culminating in the Beerhall Putsch. But what I find really interesting is that ultimately the regime that Hitler created really follows Ludendorff's script. And so I think he must have sort of tutored Hitler in the needs of Germany's future, in the kind of state that Germany was going to need to operate effectively in the kind of war that both Hitler and Ludendorff thought Germany would have to fight again sometime. I will admit it's hard to document this, but I have a very strong hunch that in this way Ludendorff is sort of the covert architect of the Third Reich. And so with that in mind, I want to just allude to the fact that Hitler then had a fairly clear agenda about what he wanted to do. Hitler came into office very clear in his own mind that Germany needed to build up militarily, the population needed to be mobilized, organized, disciplined, dissent crushed, and eventually then Germany would have to fight a major war for expansion. And we know this without much uncertainty because on about his third day in office as Chancellor in 1933, Hitler spoke to his generals, or about 20 or 25 of his military commanders, and told them in no uncertain terms, my goal is to lead us into a war for Lebensraum, for the conquest of space. This war is coming fairly soon. You military commanders will need to get ready for it. And he also said some things which revealed the character of the war that he had in mind. He said Germany needed to conquer land. And he said, often quoted line in the speech, we can't Germanize people. We can only Germanize the land. What this means is he was talking about a clearly genocidal war. A genocidal war for conquest in which the people who could not be Germanized would be removed in one way or another, and the land taken. Now, here's the thing. Hitler had to operate in his first years in politics in a democracy. And he knew he was not going to get elected in a democracy with this program as an agenda. So for the Nazis to come to power, the agenda had to be modified. The agenda had to be sold to people in ways.
Can I just interrupt you because we have some problems with the audio. Can we use the clip-on microphone? I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah, sure. Do not adjust yourselves. Are we good? Testing?
That is a commercial break we now have. So, we'll continue with the main act in just a few seconds.
Okay, thank you.
Over to you, Ben. Perhaps repeat the last few sentences if you would.
So let me see. So Hitler certainly was wise enough to know that advocating genocide and a genocidal war was not an electably saleable program. To get into power, the Nazis would have to base their appeal on something different. And here's where we come closer to the question of how it was that Hitler and his regime, Hitler and his party could come into power in the Germany of the Weimar Republic in what we know from many, many media representations, was a highly progressive, highly creative, highly innovative country and society with a very sophisticated and progressive democratic constitution. And that such an enlightened and civilized country could give way to what's arguably the most barbaric regime in human history seems like a permanent puzzle. And many brilliant people for almost 100 years have been trying to figure out what that puzzle is. And I want to add my modest thoughts on that at this point. So, in a way, it's not unrelated to the problem that Hitler and Ludendorff saw when they looked at the world. Many Germans looked at the world in the 20s and early 30s, and they saw a world that was really victimizing Germany as they saw it. Many Germans, maybe most Germans, felt that Germany had in a sense become the football for powerful world forces that it couldn't control and that it was being victimized by. This had a lot to do with the ending of the First World War, the way the war had ended, the peace settlement that emerged from it, particularly in the form of the famous Treaty of Versailles, which most Germans felt was unduly harsh and vindictive, although scholars have gone on for a century saying it was not, and I think correctly, but Germans thought it was, and that perception mattered. Around the Treaty of Versailles, there were a number of other arrangements. Germany had to pay reparations to some of the victorious allies under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. These reparations payments were constantly renegotiated during the 1920s, which meant that they were sort of constantly in the front of the minds of Germans. And then to pay the reparations, the Germans had to finance them somehow, and this developed into a complex arrangement whereby particularly American banks were making complicated and substantial loans to various levels of German government so that Germany could in turn pay its reparations to the West. As part of these arrangements, Germany's whole financial system really came under Allied control. Germany's central bank was substantially regulated by the wartime Allies. Germany was obliged to keep its currency on the gold standard. That was regulated by the Allies. Part of the significance of that being that the old gold standard operated in such a way that it limited the amount of money a government could put into circulation and limited government expenditures, and that was very much the point, because by limiting government expenditures, it also limited military expenditures. And so keeping Germany on the gold standard was a way for the British and the French also to really effectively limit German military expenditure. Germans felt they were being victimized by trade arrangements in the post-war world, where under American and British influence there had been an impetus towards lower trade barriers. Particularly in agricultural products, German farms were really hurting under the competition of cheaper grain imports, particularly from the New World. And interestingly, even border control was an issue. Germany had a new border with Poland. Poland was, of course, a new country, becoming a new nation-state emerging out of the peace settlement at the end of World War I. And Germans sometimes referred to the border as the bleeding border. And across it flowed a very large refugee flow. For the most part, people fleeing the violence that arose out of the Russian Revolution and the Civil War. Several 100,000 refugees passed across that border into Germany in the years just after the end of World War I. And this caused to arise a certain nativist hostility on the part of many Germans towards these migrants. Many of the migrants were Jews, many of them Orthodox Jews from the East, and this too stimulated a certain amount of nativist hatred. And so border control became a quite significant issue in the Weimar Republic, and quite a significant right-left issue about control of the border. So in all of these ways, Germans felt at the mercy of the world and victimized by the world. And this brings me to what is really my sort of main contention about why it is that Hitler and the Nazis, seemingly, after all, to us, such a repellent party, such a repellent leader, such a repellent ideology, why it is that they could succeed electorally in this very civilized country. And the answer to that is that if you look, I think, at the combination of the messages the Nazis put out in election campaigns, and then you look at with whom those messages resonated, and where the Nazis got votes, from what regions of Germany, from what kinds of people in those regions that got votes, what you see is that the Nazis succeeded electorally because they were the party that was most effective at mounting a nationalist challenge to what we now call globalization. No one used the word globalization in the 1920s and 30s, but that's what the Nazis were talking about, and their policy was going to be a nationalist assertion of German sovereignty against these forces of globalization. Their electorally successful arguments pretty much all boil down to that. Let me point to where it is that they first started to succeed electorally. For about the first 10 years after World War I, the Nazis got nowhere in elections. For instance, in 1928, in National Reichstag elections in that year, the Nazis gained just over 2% of the vote. Even in the Weimar Republic, with its many political parties and its complicated electoral system, that's nowhere, that's a fringe party. But 2 years later, in 1930, in elections in September of that year, the Nazi vote jumped to just over 18%. And that, although 18% might not sound a lot to you, in the Weimar system that was a lot, and it made the Nazis the second biggest party, literally overnight, in Germany's parliament. 2 years later, they more than doubled that vote total, getting up to a little above 37% in parliamentary elections in July 1932. So now, they were not only the largest party, they were nearly double the strength in parliament of the next biggest party, the Social Democrats. So they were now a major, major factor in German politics, pretty close to the most electorally successful party ever in German politics. And so this is a fact that really needs to be explained. And my contention is we can largely understand it by looking at the arguments the Nazis made about global forces, the global economy, finance, trade, border, and certainly national defense, and the people with whom that resonated. And with people with whom it first began to resonate, it was largely a matter of people living in rural areas in northern and eastern Germany, precisely because rural areas had been hard hit by the crisis of farms going bankrupt because they were subject to food imports from the New World with which they could not compete. And this gave rise to a very radical, very sort of populist, angry, right-wing rural protest. In the late 20s, there was a big protest movement that was known as the country people in northern and eastern Germany. And that sort of flared up and flared back down, but then exactly the people who were in that movement started to flow into the Nazi constituency, and they started voting for the Nazis, at first in state elections, in several of the federal states in Germany's north and east, and then dramatically in 1930, in the Reichstag election where the Nazi vote first shot up. Let me give you an example of one of the Nazi politicians who I think most effectively and kind of demonstrably mobilized these kinds of arguments. One of the more interesting Nazis was a guy named Gregor Strasser, who was a Nazi activist from the very earliest days. He was an unusual combination of some, I think, rather typical, stereotypical Nazi attributes. He was a big, bruising thug who liked to fight, but somewhat counterintuitively was also a very well-educated, very bright, rather thoughtful guy who liked to relax reading classical Latin and Greek texts in the original. So in this sense, not quite your average brawling beer hall thug. And he was probably the only Nazi parliamentarian who enjoyed some significant respect beyond the reaches of the Nazi party. When he gave speeches in the Reichstag, he was often listened to with respect by other people, other Reichstag deputies. One of the most interesting speeches he gave was one in 1932, where he specifically addressed these issues of global finance and the global economy that the Nazis stood so much in opposition to. And he uttered a phrase which is often quoted. He talked about the anti-capitalist yearning, which he felt unified a very large number of Germans, whether they were voting Nazi or not. And he spoke to this sense that the capitalist system as a whole was not working for Germany in its kind of American-British global manifestation. He also talked about the demon of gold, referring to the gold standard, which again he saw as, you know, an allied tool that was controlling and manipulating Germany. And he was not entirely wrong about this. And he was one of the Nazi politicians who really effectively articulated this message. There's another, perhaps even more surprising example. Adolf Hitler is famous for having written his book Mein Kampf, sort of part mendacious memoir and part political rant when he was in prison in 1924, and then a second volume when he got out of prison. He wrote a second book, which was never published, but he wrote in 1928, imaginatively entitled Hitler's Second Book. One of the good edition of that in English was actually edited by Professor Weinberg. There's a bad edition too, stay away from it. And there's a really interesting passage in Hitler's second book where he actually talks about the outsourcing of jobs to China. And he says, he talks about a German company outsourcing its jobs to production in China, and he says, this will be a disaster. This is the kind of thing we don't need. Europeans do not benefit by this. The Chinese will do fine out of it, but we won't. So why do this? Why allow companies to do this? Now, as far as I know, European companies outsourcing jobs to China was actually not a burning issue in 1928, but I think it's quite interesting that Hitler saw it, and he saw the potential for the future and wanted to articulate it as obviously an issue he thought would have some political salability. Another very interesting phrase, and I must confess I was rather happy the day I found this when I was doing my research a few years back. Another of the more interesting and brighter Nazis was Hitler's chief propagandist, Joseph Goebbels, who had several functions within the Nazi party. He was the Gauleiter, or the party boss of Berlin from 1926 on. He was the editor of one of the Nazi newspapers, a Berlin paper called the Angriff, or the Attack. And later on, he was propaganda minister when the Nazis came to power. In an editorial in his paper in 1932, Goebbels wrote, and I quote, "Do we want to build a wall around Germany? Yes, we want to build a wall." And this again was an expression of the Nazis' nationalist hostility to everything global that they opposed. And again, their success in elections and their success with particular segments of the German population being most hit by the effects of globalization, I think attests to this relationship, this in this case successful relationship of message and audience. So this, I think, is why the Nazis were able to do well electorally, but that doesn't actually fully answer the question of why they got into power, because for that there is a sort of second part which we need to touch on. The second part basically goes like this. The Weimar Constitution was very complicated. I don't want to bore you with its intricacies and complexities this evening, but a basic point here is that the Weimar Republic had an elected president who was elected by all the people to serve a term of 7 years, and the president had significant powers under the Constitution. One of those powers was the appointing of a chancellor to lead a cabinet, lead an administration, an executive branch really in American terms. And so the president had some considerable discretion in who became chancellor. A chancellor had to be able to maintain the support of 50% plus one of Reichstag deputies in order to stay in office, but in the first instance, the president could nominate who this was going to be. By extension, this means the president could not nominate someone he didn't want to nominate. Now, the president, at the critical times here, was the First World War Supreme Commander, former Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg, elected to the presidency in 1925 and then re-elected in 1932. Hindenburg was a very dignified old gentleman born in 1847, I think, and had had a sort of mediocre military career and retired in 1911, but then was called back into service in World War I and really fluked his way into the command at Germany's only real major battlefield victory in World War I, the battle known as the Battle of Tannenberg, which stopped the Russian advance into East Prussia in 1914. It was actually Hindenburg's subordinates who were really responsible for the tactical and strategic success of Tannenberg, but Hindenburg was the commander and he got the credit. He was a tall, distinguished, stately man. His natural facial expression was sort of grave and solemn, and people read into that a certain amount of depth, probably largely inaccurately, but it worked for him politically. And he sort of went on through his life, managing to take credit for things that went well, and managing to shove the blame for things that went badly off onto his subordinates. He was quite good at that. The point here is that he was the one who would decide in critical moments, 1928, 1930, 1932, who was going to move into the office of the chancellor and have a real effective executive power in Germany. And he didn't like Hitler very much. He always referred to Hitler dismissively as that bohemian private, inaccurately thinking that Hitler had been born in what is now the Czech Republic, whereas of course Hitler was born in Austria. But the contempt there, the kind of Prussian aristocrat, senior officer contempt for an Austrian person of low rank, comes through loud and clear. After that July 1932 election that I mentioned where the Nazis got over 37% of the vote, it would have been a natural thing for Hindenburg to ask Hitler to be chancellor since he was leading the biggest party. And they had a meeting to discuss this a couple of weeks after the election. And Hindenburg refused to make Hitler chancellor. Notes of the meeting convey to us Hindenburg's thoughts. What he said is rather interesting. I think it's almost cute. Hindenburg said to Hitler, "I cannot reconcile it with my conscience to turn the Reich over to someone like you whose party is biased against its political opponents." Now, to say the Nazis were biased against their political opponents at a time when Nazi thugs were night after night engaging in significant street violence with their political opponents is putting it rather gently. But I think we have to give Hindenburg at least credit for getting that far, not bad for an elderly field marshal. In any case, he refused to give Hitler the chancellorship. He refused again in November of that year after another election. It's clear he didn't want Hitler as his chancellor, and yet, a couple months after that, in January 1933, he gave way and named Hitler his chancellor. So why? That's another of the mysteries in this whole complicated narrative. And there is a complicated story behind this. Perhaps very selfishly, I can say, you can read my book for some more of the details. But I'm trying to convey a little bit of the gist here. There was a very complicated political dance going on. The dance had been going on for a couple of years by this point. Around 1929 or 1930, some of the people who had President Hindenburg's ear, some of his key advisors, chief among them a general named Kurt von Schleicher, they had concluded that Hitler and his party offered both a threat and a promise. The promise was that this was a rapidly growing political party, rapidly obviously growing in vote share, which was indisputably anti-communist, which was nationalist, and which was militarist. And Schleicher, like the people around him, were looking for ways to move Germany away from its parliamentary democracy towards a more authoritarian nationalist political system where the army would have more power. And so they looked at Hitler's movement, and they saw a movement which could, in a sense, be the electoral support base for that movement. It could be the sort of base in the population, the anchor of support that they were wise enough to know even a dictatorship needs, or even an authoritarian government needs, if it wants to carry out its agenda. So they saw a promise in Hitler's movement, but they also saw a threat. Because there was also an element of radicalism in the things the Nazis said in those days. Remember what I said about Gregor Strasser and his speech about anti-capitalist yearning. That kind of language worried some of the elites. It worried the senior officers. It worried a lot of big business leaders. And they thought, the Nazis might be a little dangerously communist, actually. General Kurt von Schleicher very definitely thought that. And he worried that if Hitler and the Nazis didn't come into power in some way, then their following would be frustrated and would move over to the communists. And at that time, the Communist Party in Germany was also fairly rapidly gaining votes. And Schleicher feared that if the Nazis didn't get power, then their base would go to the communists, and the communists would get power. The communists would be unstoppable. So Schleicher wanted to find a way to harness the Nazis and bring them behind an elite government. He was joined in this desire by a number of other senior military figures and some senior people from big business who were all looking for a way to move Germany away from its parliamentary democracy, move it towards authoritarianism, harness the Nazis, but not give Hitler and his fellow leaders of the Nazis any real power. And this was the dance that these groups went through for several years, especially between 1930 and 1932, each trying to use the other. So you see here, you have a kind of establishment elite, conservative, old guard, seeing a more radical, potentially destabilizing right-wing movement, trying to harness it. That radical destabilizing right-wing movement is trying to use the elite to open the door. Hitler and his party, they need Hindenburg to open the door to office. Hindenburg and his advisors need the sort of support base for nationalist goals and for their agenda as a whole that Hitler and his party seem to offer. And so they go around and around each other for several years until finally, after a good deal of scheming, which would make a good TV miniseries, I think, a lot of sort of sleazy skullduggery and backstabbing and so on in the higher reaches of German politics, the end result is that finally President Hindenburg caves, and at the end of January 1933 offers Hitler the chancellorship and brings him into a cabinet in which Hitler is joined by 2 fellow Nazis and then 8 politicians of the, one might say, conventional establishment right. So Hitler would never have come to power, would never have been able to come to power without this kind of accommodation with some key representations of traditional elite forces. He would not have been able to come to power if his message of nationalist resistance against globalization had not had a considerable resonance in the German people. And all of this is a kind of reflection of Germany's predicament in the years after World War I, of seeming to be very much at the mercy of a bunch of global forces. There is a lot more, of course, that can be said about all this, but I think perhaps I'll leave it with that for now and turn things over to Professor Weinberg.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. Yeah, we can take that to your seat on the right there. And now, Pete, would you switch on Professor Weinberg's microphone? Yeah. So thank you again, Ben, for giving us this interesting analysis of how Hitler came to power, and perhaps we later can discuss what could have been done to prevent it. But now over to Gerhard Weinberg to give us a brief comment on what we just heard, what Ben told us about Hitler's rise to power. Professor Weinberg, over to you.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
That always helps. I would like not to disagree, but to emphasize two issues which it seems to me need to be emphasized when we consider that in the last free elections in Germany, the vast masses of people voted for Hitler and his party, things that he was pushing that seemed okay. Start the well-known, but in the long run, in my opinion, less significant issue was that starting in early April of 1920, Hitler in public began to call for the extermination of the Jews. The issue of life and death is related for most people in Germany to the experience of World War I, in which approximately 2 million Germans had lost their lives. And there had been a publicity campaign from parts of the political right that the Jews, excuse me, were not doing their share. So they had to count a statistical analysis in the 1916-17 period, and as we know today, discovered what an analysis of German society would have told them beforehand, and that is that the percentage of Jews serving in the military, being killed and wounded, was slightly higher than that of the others. But at the time, this was kept strictly secret and was not released till after the statistics, the Second World War. And the other aspect of the war as far as the German public was concerned, excuse me, and that I think is very important, is the German experience of war. When Germans thought of war in the 1920s and 30s, they first thought of the wars of German unification. The 1864 war against Denmark, which was fought in Denmark. The 1866 German Civil War, which was fought overwhelmingly in Austria-Hungary. and the 1870-71 war, which was fought in France. And what I think is even more important is what happened in the First World War. In no other country in Europe, or for that matter in the world, could a political party and leader expect massive support when they were arguing for another war, as Hitler and his party and his published book, Mein Kampf, made clear they wanted. 99% of the fighting and bombing of World War I had again occurred outside Germany. War was something that happened elsewhere. And I don't believe that if that had not happened that way, and was clear in the memory of the German public that in free elections, enormous numbers would have voted for a leader and a political party that called for more wars. After the experience of the First World War, nothing of that sort could have happened in any other country in Europe. It is that aspect of war experience that, in my judgment, needs to be added, if you will, to the rise of a political party which a few years after a destructive war that had cost millions of lives is arguing in public, in speeches, in writings, for more wars. What is relevant in this, in my judgment, is that the experience of the German masses came to be different the next time. In World War II, unlike World War I, the Germans got lots of bombing. In the last 8 months of World War II in Europe, fighting was in Germany. This was a fundamentally different experience. The German public had to learn the hard way that if you do not want your house to burn, it's best not to set the world on fire. They could not complain that they had been misled. Hitler and his political associates had never made any secret of the fact that they thought Germany should fight more wars. And they sure got to. And while before being defeated, they had managed to kill approximately 1/3 of the world's 18 million Jews, they had also almost tripled Germany's own military deaths in that war. from the 2 million that I mentioned a moment ago to something over 5,300,000. We know this retroactively. But in a world which was recovering from, or trying to recover from, the First World War, which in other countries people thought was about all you needed for the century and would have been better off without. The idea of a leader and a party arguing for more war cannot, in my judgment, be understood unless we pay attention to the somewhat differing view of war experience that the German public, or at least very large portions of it, had at the time that the National Socialists were striving for and eventually actually attaining power. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Dan, can I ask you to respond to your responder?
Sure. Can you hear me? I think this is still on. Yes? Okay. So I'll sort of say what Professor Weinberg said. I come not to disagree, but maybe to look at the thing from a slightly different angle. I would say this, Klaus mentioned that one of the things I've worked on lately was a project on intelligence services, and intelligence people have a saying that the challenge is to distinguish the signal from the noise. Because, there's a lot of noise, you're listening for the nugget of accurate information, it can be hard to find it. And I think actually Hitler's messaging is a bit of a case in point. I think if you were a German voter in the 20s or 30s, there would have been a bit of a challenge in finding the signal in the noise. Because Hitler put out a lot of different messages. Mein Kampf, without a doubt, there's no doubt. The author of Mein Kampf wants to steer towards a war. But often when he spoke in political context, and especially the closer he got to power, Hitler really dialed that back, and often in his speeches he talked a lot about wanting peace. Now we know that that was entirely dishonest. A German voter wouldn't necessarily know that. I'm often struck by the fact that some people say, look, Mein Kampf was there. All you had to do is read Mein Kampf and you know what this person was about. And that's true. But remember, Mein Kampf is a politician's autobiography. And that's not a genre noted usually for its truth content. Not then and not now. So you would it would be easy to be skeptical of information in Mein Kampf, even if you had managed to read it. And I don't know if folks in the audience have read Mein Kampf. It manages to actually be both, the most offensive book ever written, and also the most boring. I think it's an interesting trick to do both of those things, but Hitler managed, I don't know how many people waded through that book. It's really atrocious. So it wouldn't be easy, I think, always to pick up the point. And there's also the fact that, voters hear what they want. Goodness knows we see plenty of this in our time. I personally find it baffling that a free voter in a free democracy would consider, even for a second, giving their vote to someone who tells them point blank, I'll only observe the outcome if I win. But we saw that plenty yesterday. It happened. I don't know why, but voters do these things. Germans could have known. German voters could have known, I think, that Hitler was going to steer them to a war if they had picked up that signal in the noise. They certainly could have known that he was going to engage in policies against Jews that were brutal, even genocidal, if they could find the signal in that noise. Hitler also talked less overtly about anti-Semitism the closer he got to power in 30, 31, 32. Often in code, what we call dog whistles in American politics, you see terms in his speeches like the international spiders of finance, that kind of thing. And you know what's being said there, but it's not quite as brutal as the things he was saying in 1920 and 21. Again, signal noise. I think Professor Weinberg makes a really great and important point when he talks about the sort of geographical realities of wars, the wars of unification and World War I. They happened somewhere else for Germany, and I do think that's a really important point. And it's a really important point that World War II, in the end, happened very much in Germany, which probably explains why the Germans have been so pacifist ever since. There is, however, plenty of evidence, and you can't do opinion polls in a dictatorship, so it's hard to know with certainty, but there's plenty of evidence that the German people in the 1930s really overwhelmingly did not want another war, even though their last war had happened somewhere else. There are some things you often read, often cited in the books on this. So for instance, I'll just give you one example. The famous American reporter, William Shirer, was in Berlin in the autumn of 1938 in the lead up to the famous Munich conference when it looked like there was going to be world war over Czechoslovakia. And Hitler tried to stage a military parade in Berlin. This was in September 1938. And Hitler thought that it would be like, the images of August 1914, people flocking into the streets, cheering, throwing flowers at the soldiers. And in fact, what happened is Berliners ran. They either looked glumly at the soldiers walking by, or else they ran and tried not to see what was happening, which Shirer read, and I think accurately, as a statement of their very deep longing not to get involved in another war. So,
thank you.
On that level, I think they had sort of gotten the point one way or another.
Thank you, Ben. What you just said, that the German voters were confused about whether or not Hitler really wanted a war. Does that explain to us the policy of appeasement by the British, for example? Were they also genuinely confused? So was appeasement a very last positive attempt to preserve peace? So do you understand Chamberlain's policy?
Well, I think so. So, of course, Neville Chamberlain was the British Prime Minister who is remembered to history as the guy who said that he looked into Hitler's eyes and saw a man whose word could be counted on when he had given it, and made the Munich settlement appeasing Hitler, and he's known forever after as this cowardly, wimpy fool who tried to make a deal with Hitler. Actually, Professor Weinberg and I were just talking before about how there's probably more to be said for Chamberlain than that. I think if you think of that time and try to imagine what this looks like through Chamberlain's eyes, in 1938, on Chamberlain's shoulders was the whole question of would there be another war or not, and everyone expected the next war to be much worse than the last. And he had to bear that responsibility, and what he was trying to do was avoid it. What he was trying to do was not have another war. It seems to me trying to talk to someone instead of having a war is a policy I find hard to condemn. And indeed, Chamberlain was aware. He was not a stupid man at all. He was aware of these conflicting signals that Hitler put out. And if you look at his letters, or some of his comments in British cabinet meetings, you see him aware of sort of two-track possibilities. He says, well, maybe we can make a deal with Hitler, maybe he'll calm down, maybe we'll avoid a war. If not, we're getting time, and we need time to build up our air defenses in particular, and get ready if a war comes. So he knew there was this time element that he could play for. I think he was very much alive to that conflicting signals problem.
Thank you. When you go back to basics, and you want to explain in 3 or 4 or 5 points why Hitler did come to power, and why that wasn't avoided, how would you summarize that?
Popularity of message, particularly the anti-global message, desire of certain powerful elite segments in German society to harness him if they could. 3, I didn't really touch on this, but 3 I think is important, and I would suggest, like the first 2, bears some comparison to things today. The Nazis were very skillful at the dark arts of politics, political messaging. They were very skillful at propaganda. They were very media forward for their time. The Nazis made effective use of cinema, of radio, of phonograph records. This is all, the Facebook, or Facebook is actually surpassed it. This is all the, hippest social media, whatever the hip social media is for young people, I probably don't even know. It's the hip social media of its time. The Nazis used it effectively. And they knew where to sort of go for the gut. Hitler understood one thing very well, which is that you have to, if you want to succeed, you have to craft a political message that kind of goes for the gut. It goes to, especially to anger or fear. Whereas there were plenty of German politicians then, as I think there are some American politicians now, who try to be a little too high-minded for their own electoral good and try to hit a lofty message which isn't going for the gut and succeeding. Hitler knew where to go with messaging. So I think that's basically 3 factors. I would say 3.
When you look around the world today, and you see, I quoted the Hungarian regime, the new Italian Prime Minister, and other people around the world, do you see any similarity at all? Or do you think that these are really different times? We shouldn't refer back to the Nazis and Hitler?
Yeah, that's always kind of the overarching question. One of my favorite historians, the British historian H.A.P. Taylor, once wrote, people usually learn from studying mistakes in the past how to make even different mistakes in the future. And I think, there's a lot of merit to that, and it's very, very difficult to draw historical parallels because things are always very different. That said, I think there are structural problems in the world. I think there are structural issues in the world now, which are really quite closely recapitulating the 1930s. I think the rise of right-wing authoritarianism, the rise of nativism, the sort of opposition between a global capitalist democratic order and a nativist, protectionist, more authoritarian order that we see in most of these right-wing regimes. I think that's recapitulating what was kind of the key issue of the 1920s and 30s. On the level of personality, I think the comparisons get much more difficult. I don't think Viktor Orban can be realistically compared to Hitler or Mussolini. He's much more cautious. He's probably much smarter. The one I always get asked about, Donald Trump is not even remotely comparable to Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler was immensely smarter, immensely more ruthless, and certainly immensely more evil. I will give that. That's a comparison that doesn't work. But I think at a deeper structural level, there are structural things even in American politics which do bear some comparison to the sort of structural politics of Germany in the 20s and 30s.
Let me ask first you and then Professor Weinberg, what could have been done in 1930s Germany or even late 1920s Germany to prevent the development of Hitler into that person which then assumed power and embarked on a world war?
Yeah, so I think the easiest fix would have been for the elites who opened the door to him not to open the door to him. And this kind of started with the process in the late 20s where the guy I mentioned, Krasno, started overturning established, fairly settled democratic governments. This happened a couple of times when it didn't need to. Between 1930, after 1930, there didn't need to be an election until 1934. Schleicher's scheming had gotten rid of a chancellor and an administration that could have stayed for a while and would have preserved the republic, if not in a very liberal sense. So I think that's the easiest one. Other fixes become more complicated, but I think I say in my book, the Weimar Republic didn't die, it was murdered. And it was murdered by some of these people in powerful positions. So that would be the way not to have it end.
And right from the start, the Weimar Republic wasn't really accepted, was it?
Well, I think it wasn't accepted by some of those very powerful people. I think actually, in my respectful view, it's a bit of a myth that it wasn't accepted by ordinary people. I think there was a period where it was settling in. I think if you look at 1928, say, you're looking at something that's a lot like West Germany in the 1950s, with the political extremes fading a little bit, the political center growing, the economy doing well. It's then in a couple of years after that that things really go down the drain.
Thank you. Professor Weinberg, what could have been done to prevent Hitler coming to power?
The people the people not having this view of war as something that takes place elsewhere, the people becoming accustomed to the functioning of a parliamentary democracy. And finally, the elites, both economic and political and social, not picking, in a sense, an individual who was really quite outside their parameters, if you will. The willingness to lead to follow as a leader someone who had this kind of a extraordinary record and was not even a German to begin with, but came from another country, and that would have been an alternative that would have been very significant in my opinion.
Thanks very much. And once Hitler was in power, was it then too late? There's always a discussion about the role of the German army or the role of outside politicians, including the American president, the British prime minister, and others. So was it really too late, or could have been something been done about that?
Yeah, I mean, something could have been done if, as you say, there was a sort of now famous moment in 1938 around the time of Munich when some German military men were conspiring to get rid of Hitler if things really went into the war. I mean, what could have happened is the military could have moved him out of power. That would have opened some problematic doors, though, and to be fair to them, the military men were aware of this. It would probably open up the prospect of civil war. It would probably open up the prospect of something that had been a problem in Germany after World War I, the idea of a stab in the back, the idea of betrayal of, in this case, Hitler's government by its military people. Germany would have been divided. Hitler probably would have had an aura about him of having been successful until he was killed or removed by the army. So once Hitler's in power, it's hard to see things ending in any way that's good, I think. Like, things are going to some kind of bad end at that point.
Would you agree with that?
I would largely agree, and I think from the outside we have to keep in mind that in 1920, the Americans decided to stop the Earth and get off. And the assumption of Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover was that the Earth would and could not turn without permission from Washington. This turned out to be a totally preposterous notion, and there is an interesting comparison of monuments, if I may use them. If you ever have been or go in the future to Normandy, you will see you will be taken by guides and guardians to the American cemetery near Omaha Beach. They will be too polite to tell you that these are some of the thousands of Americans who paid with their lives for that 1920 decision. It was not a coincidence, I would suggest, that in that same year of 1944, then President Roosevelt had picked as his vice president and successor one of those hundreds of thousands of American soldiers who in the First World War got on a troop ship on this side of the Atlantic and disembarked in a French port on the other side of the Atlantic and did not have to storm any beaches with masses. This was somebody who believed in what had been turned down by the American public in 1920, namely deterrence. You can compare all this. If you're ever in Berlin, in Germany, there is a monument for the 37, I think it was, or 32 British and American airmen who died, who lost their lives in the Berlin airlift. In other words, after World War II, under Truman's leadership, the United States followed a totally different policy. There are no big cemeteries in Western Europe for American soldiers who died trying to land to replace the Red Army. The Russians paid attention and stopped. And the one time they tried to take a little more, which was the western sectors of Berlin, they failed, and there were some who paid for this with their lives. But it was a fundamentally different American policy after World War II compared to that after World War I. And, excuse me, we cannot, in my judgment, look fairly at the developments of the 20s and 30s in Europe and East Asia without paying attention to the fact that the country that had emerged from the First World War as in many ways the most powerful and important had decided in 1920 that we were leaving and would not even consider the deterrence treaty that the American delegation had proposed, that had been signed, but was not even submitted to the US Senate to be voted down.
Thank you very much. Let me ask you a final question before we open it up to questions from the audience, both here in the auditorium and also on Zoom. Appeasement. Could outside powers, particularly of course Britain and France at that time, could they have stopped Hitler at least embarking on war? And do you see the parallel which we still draw, the lesson from appeasement? We have to stand up to aggressive power. We can't possibly negotiate and talk, which is now again revived regarding Putin's Russia. Is there anything in that? How do you see that?
I think that's a great question. Actually, the book I wrote after the death of democracy is pretty squarely on that subject, actually. So, you know, the point I tried to make in that book, which is called The Nazi Menace, is that there's a learning curve for democracies dealing with aggressive, threatening authoritarian regimes. And I think you see in the 30s and 40s, leaders in democracies kind of going up that learning curve. Franklin Delano Roosevelt said something really interesting in 1937. As he's just starting to become alive to the threat that Nazi Germany poses. He said, we need to find a way, I won't be able to quote the exact word, but we need to find a way, we need to find a modern technique to deal with this. We need to find a new way. It's hard to blame someone in the 1930s for not thinking that, for thinking that a major war is not a good option. On the other hand, of course, we know the outcome, that really only a war was going to stop Hitler. So, the thing is, we know that in retrospect, they didn't know it forward. And so I think we need to bear that in mind when we think about what they did in the 30s. That said, I mean, we certainly know in retrospect that only a military effort was going to stop Hitler. Historians debate whether it would have been better if the military effort came earlier. One of the sort of cottage debates about the Munich settlement of 1938 is, what if war had come in 1938, would it have gone better for the Allies? And military historians don't agree at all. Some say, well, the British would have gotten squashed even more thoroughly than they did in 1939-40. Some say it would have been better because the German army was weaker. I'm not sure we'll ever really have an answer to that. I think, I'll just say one more thing on Professor Weinberg's point. I think that's a really important point about the Cold War and the airlift and how that reflects the learning curve. Because there's always sort of a middle way. There are ways to think creatively, I think, about forceful resistance that doesn't go right to the element of all-out war. I think the Berlin airlift is a great example. Berlin airlift was a really imaginative, smart, creative policy, which dealt effectively with a problem that could really have been, could have blown up into World War III. Or John F. Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis dealt really, really intelligently, I think, with a really critical problem. He's always aware of the nuances of not backing Khrushchev too far into a corner, giving him an out, and so on. There are ways to deal with crises somewhere between appeasement and capitulation and war. Of course, it's easy to say that. The hard thing is to find the point where that is.
Any final word on that, on the appeasement?
No, I agree with what has just been said. I think we have to recognize that American policy after the First World War was horrendously mistaken. The deterrence concept we tend to forget was developed at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Congress of Vienna in 1814-15, they decided we don't want those French armies running on Europe again. So they insisted that those countries in the line so that the French would lay down would immediately run out into some little principality, but it was a major power that we were done. It worked. The French did not run all the way to Moscow again a few years before. The concept of deterrence worked. That was why the French then at the Paris Peace Conference at the end of the First World War wanted that territory separated from Germany, but since the peace treaty was to respect minorities, the Americans and the British said we can't do that. We will go to deterrence instead. And if the Germans run Austria a third time, the way they did in 1970 and in 1914, we will come in and solve it. And as I mentioned, the United States, the public supported in 1940 a rejection of this concept, and to everybody's great surprise, the earth continued to turn without Washington's permission.
Thank you very much. Let's open it up to a question from the audience. Can I ask anyone to perhaps ask the first question? Yeah, please.
Can we take any switch it on? Yeah. Can we take any comparisons or parallels to bring Vladimir Putin and Russia and this current war into the equation with some of the things that happened at the end of World War I, the end of World War II, things that we may not be seeing with regards to nationalism. To my knowledge, there's not really a racial component to the current situation around the unity sanctions, which could possibly give rise to more nationalism.
So for my money, actually, it's interesting to take your last point. It's still working. Can you hear me? Yep. Okay. Is there a racial element? It depends what you think racial means, because, of course, what is a race? It's all socially constructed. It seems from a lot of Putin's comments and from people around him that they have, in effect, racialized the Ukrainians as some sort of other. And it seems to me they are, within the limits of their military capacity, carrying out a war that has at least elements of genocide, not entirely dissimilar to the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, maybe ironically. That said, I think that it seems to me, as I would say flat out, certainly not an expert on Eastern Europe,
But as sort of a student of the outbreak of World War II, I will say that it looks to me like what's happened in Ukraine in the course of this year, or maybe a bit of last year and into this year, is we've sort of done about 1935 to 1940 really fast. And I think we've sort of gone quickly through a phase where negotiation might have been a viable strategy to a phase where there's no possibility of negotiation with someone conducting a genocidal war. So where we are right now, I actually like what Zelensky said, President Zelensky said, I think yesterday or the day before, he said something like, we will negotiate when Putin's gone. And it seems to me that's a reasonable position. I think probably people in the West should follow it. I think the scale of atrocities and the barbarity of Russia's war in Ukraine is such that we cannot talk to that government and that man until they have really been militarily defeated. I see no way around that. I pray that whatever happens in the new Congress, we will continue to back Ukraine, because I think this is a critical thing. This is where, I've said in some instances, it's a bit like the Spanish Civil War of the late 30s. This is like the battle where democracy is first coming under test from an authoritarian challenge. And we might want to not make the mistakes of the 30s this time. I think we might want to back the democracy, especially since the democracy is performing pretty well there.
So you do draw a lesson between the 1930s and the present.
I guess reluctantly, I am drawing a lesson. I may have to think a little bit about reconciling my super hawkness on Ukraine to some of my positions on the privilege, but there it is.
Okay, thank you. This gentleman here, please.
Given the passage of time, we see a large resurgence of anti-Semitism now in the world today. Recent events by right-wing extremists in celebrity world and in past president of the United States of America. So I'm curious to see, Mr. Weinberg in particular, your perspective, given the time that's elapsed, that we're seeing a resurgence of anti-Semitism that we've never seen in several decades.
I'm sorry, we have seen a rise of anti-Semitism, for the first time for decades. How do you explain that, and are you worried about it?
When people get worried about whatever it is, they want to find a way of coping that they feel is safe. And since the Jewish community is minute, is practically everywhere, that is a safe way to express your hatreds, disappointments, hopes for change, and so on. And when that happens, reality is never allowed to interfere. The example that I gave in my comments earlier, that when the Germans complained that Jews, then Germans were serving in the army, and they, in the First World War, they did a statistical study and discovered that Jews were serving more percentage-wise than non-Jews. And since Allied bullet shells and bombs did not discriminate on the basis of religion, curiously enough, Jews were dying and being wounded by and since statistics are those things were kept secret. You see the same thing today in an area where technology is not allowed to interfere with prejudice. If you read newspapers, listen to TV, watch your computer, you will never be reminded that the first Arabs had logically moved into the area when they were in the 7th century, in the 630s. At that time, talking about the 630s, Jews have been there for about 2,100 years, since about 1500 before the Common Era. That chronological discrepancy is never allowed to interfere. Having come there 2,100 years after the Jews, the Arabs are the original inhabitants. You can see them in the newspapers, radio, television, and so on of the country. When people have some little prejudice, neither statistical nor chronological realities are ever allowed to interfere with the prejudice.
Thank you very much, Ben. How do you see the rise of anti-Semitism during the last few years?
So there's a really brilliant historian named Shulamit Volkov, who's she's a historian of anti-Semitism in pre-World War I Germany. And one thing she said, I think, was particularly enlightening. She talks about the anti-Semitism of that era being a kind of symbolic language in which people who were losing from the effects of modernity could express their grievances. And I think that's as true now as it was then. There's a certain kind of language and a certain kind of collection of symbols that has accrued to anti-Semitism over the years. That Jews are linked with capitalism, that Jews are linked with international forces, that they don't have a homeland anywhere, that kind of thing. And that's a very flexible vocabulary which can appeal to political right and left, which I think is why you see manifestations of anti-Semitism coming from political right and left now as well as then. And so I think that has a lot to do with it. And I agree with what Professor Weinberg said about, how people with grievances are going to reach for something. It won't be rational. It may affect a minority that's really too small to push back. And I think for all of these reasons, Jews are sort of the canary in the coal mine whenever there's trouble. So whenever there is discontent, whenever there's economic injustice, political discontent, I think it's an easy language to reach for, and it gets reached for. And it has, certainly, I agree with Professor Weinberg, it's got absolutely zero to do with rationality.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yes, over there, Mike.
Thanks. I wonder if you could say something about how we should understand the role of the Soviet Union in the story of the Hitler's rise to power and coming of the Second World War. Should we see Stalin as offering a possibility, a lost possibility for stopping the coming of the Second World War, for example, either through cooperation with the Western Allies, or on the other hand, should we see communism as a force that maybe accelerated Hitler's rise to power, insofar as people in the West or in Germany thought Hitler as an alternative to communism, a barrier to communism? Where does Stalin, the Soviet Union, and communism fit into this overall picture?
Thank you, Ben.
Well, I have a view on that, definitely. Let me take the sort of first part of your question. There are historians who think that not bringing in the Soviets early, like in 1938, represents a lost opportunity. I think if you actually look at what Stalin was doing and what he thought about what his army did at that time, he and his regime were really only ever a very nefarious presence and very much an enabler in the end of, especially the Nazis' Hitler's early military plans. The idea that the Soviets could have been brought into Munich, at the time of Munich in the fall of '38 to attack the Nazis. If you look at what Soviet military deployments actually were, and some of their commanders were quite frank about this, they were going to invade Poland. And they were actually literally getting ready on their border for a genocidal war against Poland. That was going to be their answer to the Nazis taking Czechoslovakia. So, Stalin was as brutal and as unscrupulous a mass murderer as Hitler, and was, in my view, in no sense an answer to Hitler, at least at that stage. What happened after 1941 is a little different, but Stalin didn't have much choice in my view. On your first question, I wouldn't necessarily link, for all explanatory purposes, communism everywhere to Stalin's regime, but certainly in Germany, the German communists were in some sense a kind of unintending, mostly unintending, mostly unwitting enabler of the Nazi rise. Since I think you had this in your question, it was fear of communism in large part, or in considerable part, which motivated some of the Nazi constituency to vote Nazi. So, you know, as the communist vote rose in Germany after 1929-30, you sort of see the Nazi vote rising in tandem, and they're sort of, you know, mutually influencing each other. There was a missed opportunity if the German Communist Party hadn't been following Stalin's orders not to engage in any coalitions with other non-Nazi forces. There might have been an opportunity there to forge a coalition that would have been large enough to stop the Nazis in Germany in the early 30s. A Stalinist party in that time was never going to do it, but if you sort of take that factor out, it could have been done, as it was done later, a bit too late, and with not always good consequences in France and Spain and the popular government.
Thank you. But also there missed opportunity in cooperation between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union before the Hitler attack.
But it was never going to be cooperation on any terms that you could reasonably expect the British and French to accept. And this became very clear in the military negotiations in the summer of 1939 between French and British military commanders and Soviet military commanders. The Soviets kept saying, we're going to need to occupy Poland and the Baltics. And the British, especially the British, would say, yeah, but we're trying to stop aggression against small countries. So that's kind of not solving the problem. And, I have trouble, Chamberlain gets blamed for this, but I have trouble blaming him for not wishing to sell out those small countries over there to defend small countries somewhere else.
Would you like to comment?
Well, I think it's very important in this context to keep in mind not only that Stalin in late 41, early 42, was interested in a compromise peace with Germany, and Hitler always turned it down. But that during the 2 years that he was aligning with Hitler, he would do favors for his dear friend Adolf that he would never do, even think of doing, for Winston Churchill's Britain or Franklin Roosevelt's United States. He provided the Germans, I'll just give you two examples. He provided the Germans with a naval base, not far from France, to help the Germans sink Allied ships in the Atlantic and to assist them in their planned invasion of Norway. He also arranged for icebreakers to make it possible for a German warship to pass north of Siberia and get into the Pacific between Alaska and Siberia and sink Allied ships in the Pacific. When the United States and Britain were aligned with the Soviet Union after the summer of 1941 when the Germans invaded, Stalin would never dream of doing either of these things for Britain or the United States. I think we have to kind of keep that aspect of the reality in mind.
Thank you. Brian, please.
Thank you very much, Nathan, hearing all of this. I'm having a little trouble or trying to reconcile that Weinberg, you say isolation in 1920 and 21, 22 were disastrous and the or the Hitler time. And you you're saying that America does need to have some involvement, but you were like a dialogue. You weren't quite sure where. And another point you made, which was that we've never had a war
here on US soil. Let's say Germany hadn't in the First World War, and therefore were more pro to second. What about America? We have not had war here on our, apart from the Civil War. Does that make us more willing to invade Syria, Afghanistan, Grenada, Vietnam, and everywhere else with questionable results? That's one part. And the other part is really interesting when you need to find reasons for the rise of Hitler. No mention of the Depression. That was here. I'm curious about that. Thank you.
Let's start with that.
Okay, let me take the second one. Yeah, I didn't mention the Depression because it's largely subsumed in the other factors, I think. There's a pretty good argument that could be made that the real groundwork for Nazi political mobilization and the groundwork in building the constituency that would be the Nazi constituency was well in place before the Great Depression hit. It gave an opportunity, certainly, I mean, it sort of dramatized aspects of the kind of argument the Nazis were already making. But, you know, in and of itself, I wouldn't rate it so seriously a factor as some of the others. I'm sorry, I'm not sure I quite got the first part of your question about America.
That was war in America. There was never a war on American soil. So outside the country. Has that tempted the United States to be more involved in foreign war than when they experienced war themselves?
Well, America's funny that way because, I mean, the one exception to that would be the major exception would be the Civil War. But that aside, America's seesaw is crazily, of course, between isolationism and arguably excessive interventionism overseas. And it's hard to know always which way the country's going to jump. Arguably, there have been times where both isolationism and interventionism have been wrong in the moments they've been tried. I guess I would try to limit myself to the time periods I have studied it, and I'll try not to opine on things that really aren't my wheelhouse. It seems to me quite clear, I think Professor Weinberg and I would be on the same page on this. It seems to me quite clear that the 20s and 30s was a bad time for America to go into an isolationist move. And actually, to be fair, America was not so isolationist in the 1920s in practice. The global reach was done largely by the private sector, not by the government, but it was done nonetheless. In the 30s, America became much more profoundly isolationist at really the wrong time, when America's clout could perhaps have been a little bit more effective against the Nazis. Although, as I said, once Hitler's in, I think there's going to be a war one way or another. But America probably could have been more aggressive and in some ways more proactive, and certainly could have come into the war earlier.
So do you see the possibility of a neo-isolation state right now? I mean, the Biden administration isn't, but voices in Congress, they are.
Yeah, as I said, I think earlier, I worry about what the new Congress will do in terms of support for Ukraine. Should Trump come back as president in 2024? Certainly that's a possibility. I think I really worry about what will happen then. I think it's entirely possible we'll leave NATO. God only knows what else will happen. I really think we could be heading for that, and we should.
And it is happening.
He's harder to read, I think. I might be a little less worried about him in that respect.
Yeah, do you want to come in?
No, I mean, I agree with what's just said. The American people certainly went through a revolutionary war, and they fought again with labor and the notion that the oceans that are on the two sides of the country are too wide for people to swim is undoubtedly correct. But most people nowadays think of traveling intercontinentally in very different ways from swimming.
would be well if people remember that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bill, I saw you. Go ahead.
My question is actually directly kind of builds off of this conversation. I think our economies now are very interconnected because of globalization. And I'm wondering, I've seen recently that there's a rise in incredibly protectionist economic policies across the Western world, from US to France to Ukraine. And with that rise of protectionist policies, it seems like there's also a rise in folks who are, prejudiced and thoughts coming into leadership. Do you see this as a downward spiral into more and more protectionist policy, more and more authoritarian leaders?
Yeah, thanks. I like that question because I think you put your finger on something that's really important, and that is that, in my view, those things really go together. It's a point I made in my Death of Democracy, actually, that there's a fork in the road around 1929, 1930, when Germany could have decided to move towards something that would have looked a little bit like today's European Union. The talk of European integration, including economic integration, was on the table, and the German government could have gone that way. The French government was interested in it. Interestingly, the British were saying, no, we're not having any of this. So, nothing changed. And Germany chose to go another route, to go towards nationalism and protectionism. And I really think that, generally speaking, policies that aim towards integration, both politically and economically, correlate heavily to democracy. And policies that are nationalist in every sense, politically, economically, racially, ethically, they correlate heavily with authoritarianism. And I think we really see this in practice in what's happening around the world in various countries. If you look at the political movements, the leaders who are authoritarian, they also tend to be nationalists, they tend to be protectionists, they tend to frown on international institutions and multilateral ties. And I don't think that's a coincidence at all. And that's kind of what I'm getting at when I say I think we're recapitulating the politics of the 1930s right now, precisely the issue as you put it. I do think it's a problem we have now, and it is, I think, a thing to worry about.
Explain that to us with relevance to the United States. Actionists, nationalistic, skeptical of international organizations, it would all fit.
It would all, it would all fit. I try not to be totally heavy-handed about my political views when I'm talking about history, but you won't have any trouble figuring out who I'm talking about. If I talk about a political leader who's nationalist, protectionist, and has, shall we say, mild authoritarian leanings, there have been such figures in very recent American experiences, maybe again in recent American experience, and I think this is a package that all goes together.
Right. Thank you very much. Yes, please.
That actually kind of segues perfectly into what I wanted to ask about. Talking about the death and dying of democracy, we see a lot of alarmist perspectives every election cycle that the American democracy is on the verge of death. And I was just interested to get you guys' perspectives on if we're close, or if that's more of just wild election time speak in order to count our votes. Is American democracy anywhere close to actually death?
So I always tell people that I'll be very upfront about this, I might be the worst pundit in the world. I spent a good part of 2016 telling my friends, there's no way on earth Trump's going to get elected, don't worry. And, so just to sort of be clear about this. So having said that, here's how I would put it. And I might put it slightly differently today than I would have yesterday, but I think actually yesterday's election was a bit of evidence for something I've been saying for a while. As a matter of fact, I gave a talk on similar lines yesterday, in which I tried to make this point, and the audience was extremely skeptical. And the point I was trying to make was, I do not think ultimately that America will ever succumb to an authoritarian government. I think that we are too big, we're too diverse. I think Americans are too individualistic. I think there's too much deeply rooted in our culture with democracy and so on for authoritarianism ever to succeed. But I also think that doesn't mean it isn't there to worry about. And there are, without any doubt, you don't need me to tell you this, there are actors on the American scene who are very openly authoritarian in the agenda. And they're there and they have a lot of support.
But you're still moderately
I'm
optimistic.
still moderately optimistic because I think they have a lot of support, but I don't think ultimately they have enough support ever to create a thoroughgoing authoritarian regime. And I must say, I am feeling significantly cheerier today than I was about this time yesterday, because I think we saw some evidence of this in the outcome in the midterms. I think we saw a lot of little straws in the wind that Americans won't go, at least in overwhelming numbers. Americans won't go for an authoritarian solution.
Thank you. Are you moderately optimistic regarding American democracy?
Well, I prefer to be optimistic, but I do see real dangers.
Such as?
There are interesting differences. In 6 years ago, Hillary Clinton had 3 million more Americans voting for her than voted for her. But she did not argue that this was a stolen election. The procedure was simple. It's been accepted and followed for centuries, and she simply accepted that. The other side was an aspect of the 6th of January event, which worried me and still sort of rubs me wrong. And that is that among those who were conducting that riot in Washington, there was very considerable noise made about possibly killing or hanging Vice President Pence. Now, there you have a regularly nominated and elected Vice President who simply as an individual working in the American political system was about to carry out what under our Constitution and laws was what he was supposed to do. And that was, of course, to collect and announce not the fake presidential electors that in the plot were being and had been selected, but the real ones. The fact that a conservative Republican vice president was being considered by some as somebody who needed punishment for doing what under the Constitution and laws he was supposed to do is, in my way of thinking, a very dangerous sign that there are elements in our political society which simply reject the whole process that the United States has followed since its foundation. And that's a very disturbing and dangerous thing. And what makes it, if you will, particularly so is that the man who actually won the presidential election a couple of years ago had more Americans voting for him than any presidential candidate in the history of the United States. That is interesting on the one hand, but makes the objections and the attacks on those who wanted to go along with the procedure very much more a dangerous sign. I have to admit that in emails and phone calls in recent months, a number of people have asked me if I see Trump as being like Hitler. And my answer has invariably been, he's not that smart. He's much more like Mussolini, whose mouth was very much larger than his brain, but was also opposed to the maintenance of a parliamentary democratic government in Italy.
Thank you very much. We have time for one or two questions, and then we have to conclude for today. So please, here.
Anybody from the Zoom?
Yeah, so as we start to come towards the end of this conversation, I often think of the analogy of cement, right? So when you have cement and you pave it down, over time there starts to become cracks within the cement. We see this with the American government, cracks, voter suppression, dog whistling within politics, and gerrymandering. And there's just more cracks that are coming after every single election that is observed. And so my question is, with President Biden having some time in office now, trying to, I guess, to connect the analogy, pave over those cracks. He is struggling, and that's something that I personally have observed because of the, I guess you could say, the presidency before him, and also the rising inflation, and just the after effects of COVID-19. When do you feel like American democracy will start to become a little bit more civil, or that those cracks that we see will start to finally turn the page in terms of paving over them?
Thank you.
It's a great question. I won't pretend to be wise enough to give you any kind of definitive answer. I think I can give you sort of an answer. I don't think I can say when that will happen. I think I can say what would make it happen. So here's what I think would make it happen. If we can have more elections that go like yesterday or a little more so, by which I mean some of the people who are creating those cracks you talked about, if they get shown that it's not the path to winning, and they may have to get shown that a lot of times. I don't know how long that's going to take. That's why I can't pretend to really answer that. But sooner or later, the good Lord willing, they'll keep getting shown that. And sooner or later, there's going to have to be, I'm sure this is starting to happen today, there's going to have to be a movement in the Republican Party where the smarter Republicans say, this is not the path to victory. What we need is a party that expresses conservative principles but can be inclusive and not subversive of the core structures of the democratic constitution. And if we do that, we can win elections. But to do that, we need to get around this Trump guy and his approach to politics and the people who follow him. When that happens, when the Republicans do that, we will be getting somewhere to fixing those cracks. I don't know when that will be. I hope it will happen soon. I sort of think it might happen in the next decade, but actually to come back to what Professor Weinberg said, the other scenario is the awful scenario that we get more January 6th. And I fully agree with Professor Weinberg's comments on that. It was horrible. It could have been vastly worse. It's really horrible to think how much worse January 6th could have been. I don't think we're out of the woods in terms of seeing more of that. I have a certain faith that sooner or later, the first process I talked about will win out over that process.
So you are moderately optimistic.
I am moderately optimistic when all is said and done. An unusual thing for a scholar to ask.
That is, well, something good to hear tonight. We have time for one final question. Yes, please.
Testing. Good evening, Your Honor. So thank you very much for your very inspirational talk for this night. So my question is, in nowadays context, is it possible that there will be a new Hitler in our modern world? And if so, is there any potential signs that we should be aware of? And if we witness these kind of signs, what can we do? So that's somehow my question.
It's a big question.
I apologize for
to answer, but our two experts will try.
Thank you very much.
Professor Weinberg, do you think, will there be a new Hitler? Is there a new Hitler to be seen anywhere in the world?
Excuse me. Well, there are a couple around who try. Xi in China thinks of himself as a continuing ruler of the most populous and, in his opinion, most important country on earth. There are possibilities and dangers there. And that is always a possibility of these kinds of things happening elsewhere. The earth does not come with some kind of a built-in either insurance policy or guarantee for reasonableness and good sense. One of the things that historians learn relatively early is that there have been, over the millennia, really rather wild people who managed all kinds of what we would consider loony operations. And there is, I'm afraid, no built-in guarantee against that sort of thing. And one can only express hope that, at least in a goodly number of countries, the institutions are such, and the public is so accustomed to those institutions that anyone coming up with completely out of the sphere ideas remains isolated and does not attain power.
Thanks very much indeed. Reasonableness and good sense, that's what we do at UNC, you know. Ben, what do you say in response to that question?
Yeah, I mean, I basically agree with Professor Weinberg. It seems to me, looking around the world right now, the closest aspirant to the legacy of Hitler is Putin. He has the bad luck of having the armed forces that he has and not the armed forces Hitler has. The rest of us have the good luck of that. But he's trying. He's trying. I'm sure if he had won easily in Ukraine, he'd be rolling onto the Baltics or Poland or something. He's trying to be that. He's just that his military machine is not that good at it. On the other question, you know, this may sound a little bit Pollyanna-ish, but I mean it actually. You know, on this end of the room, we're old guys. On that end of the room, you're all pretty young. So the answer to that question is in your hands, not ours. And you know, when I see, as a professor working with students, what I see in my students and what I think I catch in some of the questions today is, and this will sound sort of sappy, but I mean it, it's young people that give me optimism these days. I think young people are a lot nicer than my generation when I was young. I think you mean a lot better for the world than mine did, and that's good because it's going to be up to you. So the answer to not having a Hitler is, please go out and make it not happen. Dedicate yourselves to that. Be aware of that. Be aware of politics that deals in hate and fear. You know, look for inclusion. Think hard about the institutions. Think hard about keeping those institutions going. Think hard about rationality. You know, make it not happen. Thank you.
These are good, optimistic final words. Thank you very much indeed. I would like to thank Professor Hett, Professor Gerhard Weinberg for a very interesting session today. Please join me. I would also like to thank all of you for coming today, and we have 2 more Krasno events this semester. They are coming in rapid succession, and these Krasno events are all Zoom events only. On Friday we will talk about China's economy and foreign policy and relations with the West, and we have a distinguished panel of Chinese experts put together. That is on Friday by Zoom at 4 p.m. and then on Tuesday at 5:30 p.m. also per Zoom we have a very distinguished guest, that is Ambassador Winston Lord, the man who accompanied Kissinger to Beijing, to the opening of relations with Beijing. He was an aide to Kissinger, was an aide to Richard Nixon, then himself ambassador and Assistant Secretary of State in the 1980s and 1990s. So he will join us by Zoom, and that promises to be, again, a particularly interesting event. Hopefully all of you can join us for that. But for tonight, thanks for coming, and thanks again to Professor Ben Hett and Professor Gerhard.